Well, it's been said the truth is often the first casualty of war. Well, that's certainly been true in Syria, where many journalists have been killed and countless others either forced or frightened out of the country. But as we learned, reliable information is available, often hiding in plain sight, as discovered by an enterprising intern at former President Jimmy Carter's nonprofit Carter Center. VOA's Kane Farabaugh has that story from Atlanta.
When the Syrian conflict began, one of the greatest needs was reliable information.
All we were seeing is propaganda.
But the conflict erupted in a part of the world that is well connected, digitally.
Syrians, and actually people in the Middle East in general, are 2 to 4 times as likely to share information about politics and religious views online.
That was something Christopher McNaboe, then an intern at the Carter Center, identified as an asset.
There are actually more minutes of video than of real-time conflict. The Syrian conflict represents a major paradigm shift in the way in which conflict plays out. Previous conflicts did not take place in connected environments like Syria.
Assalamu alaikum ya humat ad-diyar.
Using social media sites like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, McNaboe compiled information on the location of combatants, who they aligned with, and who was joining them.
And to tell us more about how social media is changing our understanding of the conflict in Syria, we are joined on Skype from Chicago by VOA Midwest correspondent Kane Farabaugh. Thanks for that fascinating report, Kane.
Thanks for having me, Mel.
Yeah, so essentially what you're saying is forget the propaganda. The truth is out there if you know where to look for it. Is that right?
Yeah, it's hiding in plain sight, really. There's such a volume of material out there that early on, Christopher McNaboe, who himself lived in the Middle East, so had some understanding about the trends in social media use in the Middle East, realized that people were likely to share their religious and political views online. And so if you wanted to sort of sort through all of the rhetoric and propaganda, what you could simply do is log on to Twitter, log on to Facebook, log on to YouTube, and look at a lot of this material.
So the Syrians are very willing to share this information, but I'm wondering from what you've gleaned there, what kind of information can we learn about the Syrian conflict from this mapping project?
So, I mean, there's such a volume of material out there that you have to have the tenacity, patience, and diligence to look through it all. But what you can actually do is you can look, there's defection videos. You saw in that clip there's actually videos that show you the formation of an armed opposition group. And what you can begin to do is you can generally map these things on a map. You can take where some of these videos were posted from or who they were posted about, and you can actually put them on a map. You can sort of ascertain from the information you see as you start to see these things grow and move and evolve how many people are in that group, where they're at in the country, and all of this becomes useful information once you basically zoom out from the micro or from the macro. You zoom out to it, you can actually see an overall picture of where everybody's at and who they're aligned with and what's happening.
So you're essentially, Kane, seeing sort of the changing landscape of this war based on the participants, based on the people who are actually tweeting and talking about it on social media, correct?
Right, and it's also, too, I mean, what you're able to see also is the changing front lines of the Syrian war. Obviously, as government forces move into certain locations or as opposition groups move into certain locations. Generally, you do know some of that information based on some of the media coverage, based on some of the information the Syrian government provides, based on information the opposition groups provide, but you can corroborate that by looking at some of the social media posting that's taking place in those front lines to make sure that the information you're getting or you're putting out there in this mapping project is objective.
Kane, what is the danger, you think, of some of this information perhaps falling into the wrong hands, perhaps pointing to the location of rebel or combatant groups? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Christopher McNaboe, who's the director of the Syria Mapping Project for the Carter Center, said this is a real concern that commanders and people he's talked to in the field have expressed to him. The reality of the situation is that this information is available to anybody out there who is interested in finding this information out. That could mean intelligence groups, that could mean other people, and that's just looking at the simple social media posts, the same social media posts that Christopher McNaboe is looking at.
I guess
by the time he's able to compile that information, though, he says much of that information is not useless to the combatants who are trying to figure out where the front lines are in Syria. If you're depending on his maps, it's not going to be useful to you. What his maps and his information does is present an overall understanding of where people are in the conflict.
I guess the reason why I posed that question is in a recent exclusive interview with VOA, President Carter did say that he spoke and shared the location of some of those Syrian factions with Russian President Vladimir Putin. To quote, he says, make sure he would bomb the right ones. Now, as we know, in 2015, 90% of the Russian airstrikes were directed not against Islamic State, but against some of these moderate rebel groups. So I'm wondering, could this information possibly have been used to conduct some of those Russian attacks?
Well, President Carter told me, and so did Christopher McNamara, that part of the motivation for giving the Russians this information was because they wanted to put the Russians on notice that they understood where they were targeting in Syria, and they wanted the Russians to know that the Carter Center could hold them accountable for those locations because they had accurate information about who was in the positions that the Russians said that they were bombing. So in some ways, it was meant to sort of put the Russians on notice that the Carter Center has this information and they can share this information to make sure that you objectively understand who is in the locations that you're targeting.
So, Kane, how can some of this information be used by some of the aid agencies that are trying to help out some of those civilians that are trapped in Aleppo, for example?
Well, particularly in a war environment, it's important for aid agencies to know what's the safest route to get relief supplies in, or what's the safest route for us to transfer aid into the places that need it the most. And so a lot of this information can be used to sort of help pinpoint on a map the safest route to get those supplies and those humanitarian organizations into those locations. So President Carter explained to us it's extremely useful for organizations like the United Nations that are looking for a safe route into the war zone.
So this is a useful tool for some of those humanitarian agencies. Now, who can access this information? Can a regular citizen sort of get online and find out some of the information in this Syrian Mapping Project?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the Carter Center shares this map publicly. Anybody who can log onto the internet can actually see the Syria conflict map on the Carter Center's website. And it's an interesting interactive map. You can look at the overall map. You'll see a lot of different colored dots. Those dots represent different groups involved in the conflict. Mm-hmm. You can also use that map to see how the front lines have evolved over a period of time. They've been collecting this information since 2012, so you can get a good sense of where people were at a certain point in time during this conflict, and you can kind of see how it's evolved, how it's changed, you know, who's lost control or who's gained control of certain areas. And this is entering now the 7th year of this conflict in Syria.
It's a fascinating perspective on the Syrian war, and I thank you for sharing that with us, Kane Farabaugh.